Geoffrey Samuels. He's an outstanding scholar of Tibetan medicine as an anthropologist, and so he did very well-known work on this Tibetan world, also in Bhutan, and he was a professor until 2014 in England, and now he's in Australia, the University of Sydney, affiliated, and so also professor emeritus. Vivian Law, would you like to introduce and to give the laudatio?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Professor Matthew.
Thank you, Angelica.
Thank you.
I'm very
Thank you, and Professor Vivian Lowe.
Honored to give my summary of Geoffrey's great works and life. I think he was professor in Wales rather than India. I mean England. So I should just make that correction. And I also should make the correction that this has been prepared by myself and Michael Stanley Baker. So if there are any mistakes in it, they're Michael's mistakes. Okay, Geoffrey Samuels, I think 7 well-received books. I'm not sure about that number. With their multimodal framework, are comprehensive in scope and penetrating in vision. They're not only treasured across many domains of the Academy, they also achieve top ratings on Amazon, which is an achievement in itself. So they show how perfectly suited he is to receiving the Basham Award today. From his first book, it was clear that his science and arts background were a driving force in what has become an exemplary interdisciplinary career. It was an impressive 35 years ago, sorry about that, grand. In 1990, when he published his manifesto, Mind, Body and Culture, Anthropology and the Biological Interface. The book heralded a new era with its profound critique of binary notions like science and culture, forging systematic links between ritual studies and philosophy and science, between individuals and society, between anthropology and biology, between formalized knowledge systems and more embodied cultural knowledge. In the 1993 Civilized Shamans, Buddhism in Tibetan Societies with the Smithsonian Institution Press, Geoffrey began recording his lifetime journey into the anthropology and history of Tibetan religions, from the 9th century right up to the 1950s, exploring the relationship between Tibet's social and political institutions and the emergence of new modes of consciousness that characterize Tibetan Buddhist spirituality. By paying attention to the plural nature of Tibetan communities, particularly in diaspora through Bhutan, Ladakh, Sikkim, and in India and Nepal and China, we see his work as an attack on the romantic fantasies of an isolated and socially stratified Himalayan kingdom with its moribund institutions. In presenting his new methodology, the multimodal framework for the study of human culture, Geoffrey laid the ground for an explosion of work on medical pluralism. His conceptualization of the social manifold as a way of embracing multimodal bodily and cultural experience shaped his succeeding works in South Asian studies, which are the ones that are probably best known at ICTAM. Beginning with Tantric re-envisionings in 2005, the historically and textually informed anthropological approach really took shape. Since his own PhD years at Cambridge and his dissertation on embodiment and Tibetan Buddhism, Geoffrey's fieldwork has concentrated in India, Nepal, Tibet, Bhutan and the borderlands. His book, Introducing Tibetan Buddhism in 2012, demonstrated an ability to deliver his expert knowledge with a light touch. The origins of yoga and tantra continue to deliver erudite research for a wide audience, providing the social and cultural background to a subject that is too often delivered as a disembodied, decontextualized history of religion. Geoffrey's third book, and I'm not sure about these number and sequences, but The Origins of Yoga and Tantra, Indic Religions to the 13th Century, was encyclopedic in scale and aspiration, a synthesis that not only crystallized over 1,000 years of South Asian religious history, but also folded in historiographic critiques and commentaries about legacy scholarship on South Asian religion. Not content to remain siloed within his disciplinary comfort zone, Geoffrey points out that practices such as meditation, yoga, breathing exercises, visualization, stretching, incantation and talismans, and models of the subtle body share much more in common with corresponding practices from China and India than other parts of the world. So this kind of cross-cultural history of religions is very much practice. It's very much a characterizing part of Geoffrey's work. Taken together, these 3 volumes form a triptych of approaches, one from anthropological theory and philosophy of science, another grounded in ethnographic fieldwork, and a third as a comprehensive historical work. They mark Geoffrey as the multidisciplinary polymath par excellence, whose work intersects medicine, religion, body, culture, brain, science, and consciousness studies, and as an innovative and provocative thinker in all these areas. It was during his work leading up to Religion and the Subtle Body in Asia and the West of 2013, which incidentally has 5 stars on Amazon, that I first encountered Geoffrey, and that we worked together on a few years of ICTAM's journal, Asian Medicine. The edited volume brought together a number of our mutual colleagues in a reflection on quasi-material articulations of the subtle body worldwide. Despite the plural approaches and the focus on plurality in practice, there is a remarkable consistency in Geoffrey's grand project. Continuing in this vein, one of his recent chapters in Situating Religion and Medicine in Asia, 2023, which is edited by our just newly inaugurated President, Michael Stanley Baker. He returns to a modern controversy surrounding a 17th century debate about the role of subor, did I say that right? Subor. Anyway, or channels in the body. He points out that Tibetan medicine was given to hybridity, and that to impose an empirical reading of the debate is an imposition not borne out by more nuanced readings of the primary sources. Once again, we find him rigorously historicizing epistemic debates within the context and conditions of their moments of genesis. As president of ICTAM from 2013 to 17, he successfully negotiated with Brill for open access, which was of the journal Asian Medicine, which was a brilliant contribution to our world. If I had kept ICTAM alive through some of the most difficult years, when we literally had no members at all, which needed a kind of wild renegade person like me, Geoffrey started us on the road to being a disciplined society. Discovering that the society was not legally registered in any country under my care, Geoffrey initiated the incorporation process for ICTAM, looking for locations and willing volunteers to help get ICTAM into a fully legal status. And of course we know that President Messner has overseen the completion of that process. Geoffrey also rewrote together with Angelica and Michael the ICTAM vision. So he's really at the heart of ICTAM. I've always been impressed with how generous Geoffrey is with his knowledge and learning. It has been a joy to be in his orbit and to experience the wholehearted pleasure he takes in his research and to watch its infectious quality as he nurtures younger scholars and his own research students. After his 15 or so years of dedication to ICTAM, I can't think of a more suitable candidate for the Basham Award today. The diversity of methods and approaches he uses embody the interdisciplinary ethos of our association, ICTAM.
Thank you very much to Professor Vivian Low. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Basham Medal recipient, Professor Geoffrey Samuel, to deliver his acceptance address. Please welcome him. 接下来我们有请今年的奖章的得主 Geoffrey Samuel 教授发表演讲。
Hello, is that working properly? Yeah. Thanks, yeah. Well, dear colleagues, dear friends, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd particularly like to say hello to our past president now, I guess, and to Angelica, who's a good friend, and to Michael, our new president. And to Lillian, who managed to make my career sound far more sensible, coherent, and wonderful than I ever believed it was at the time. But thank you for that wonderful interpretation of my work. I'm very honoured by the decision of the ICTAM board to make me one of the two recipients of this year's medal. Especially because I'm aware of the great scholarly distinction and the many contributions to the study of traditional Asian medicine of this year's other recipient, Professor Ken Zisk, and I guess we'll hear about that later on, who unfortunately is unable to be with us today. It's an honour in its own right, I think, to share this medal with him. As you might have heard a bit between the lines in Vivian's account, I'm a relative latecomer to studies in Asian medicine myself, and my work has been based in anthropology more than in textual studies. But I think when I moved on from the anthropology of religion, which a lot of my earlier work was about, to become more involved with questions of health and medicine, there was a great deal of continuity with some of that earlier work, as I think Vivian also explained. I was lucky enough to be part of one of the early fieldwork studies of Tibetan medicine back in the mid-1990s, and I've kept in touch with the area ever since then. It's been a delight to see the development of the anthropology of Tibetan medicine over that time, and also to see the progressive recognition of Sowa Rigpa, the traditional medicine of Tibet and the Himalayas, as a significant body of medical knowledge in its own right. But probably the most significant project to do with the medical anthropology of Tibet, with which I've been involved, relates not to Sowa Rigpa but to a different side of Tibetan healing. These are the practices that are usually known in English as long life practices, or Sedru. Se here refers specifically to the duration of life. There are other terms such as La and So, which refer to other aspects of life and also get drawn into these practices, in fact. Tibetans also talk about these practices in terms of Tsering, practices to extend life, and in terms of saying Nerdru, or Chimeng Nerdru, the attainment of power over life, or the attainment of immortality. Now this already points to a certain ambiguity about what these practices are understood to do, and I'll come back to that. But it was mainly through my initial research on Sedru, which was quite closely linked to the Subtle Bodies book, that I first became involved with ICTAM, attending the 6th ICTAM meeting in Austin in 2006. And it was also very much because of the Sedru research that I came to co-organise a panel with Vivian at the 7th ICTAM in Bhutan, got gradually drawn into becoming co-editor with her of the ICTAM journal for some years, and so gradually became part of the ICTAM community. So my work on Sedru has led to some important things in my life, particularly in relation to ICTAM. And I've continued to work on and off on this topic, and I'd like to talk today about some of my most recent work in this area. I'll begin with this ambiguity about just what it is that Sedru is meant to do. Is its purpose to preserve and extend our everyday life, health and vitality? Or is it to transcend our everyday life in some way which after all is the central aim of the Buddhist path? The answer perhaps is both. The ambiguity is never really resolved. Both purposes get stated clearly in textual sources and also in the teachings of lamas on the subject, and in the practices. I'd argue that the ambiguity is constructive. In practical terms, Tibetans are well aware that while ordinary life may be prolonged, it cannot be prolonged indefinitely. Sooner or later, everyone dies. However, the mysterious yogic power over life is another question, and that's what this term, saying Erdra, Chimeng Erdra, mostly refers to. It's associated with well-known Tibetan cultural themes such as the rainbow body, the magical dissolution of death into the elements that highly accomplished yogins can manage, and the special features accompanying the deaths of high lamas, Tudam, some of you may have heard of, where the body remains in a kind of state of meditation for some days or weeks after death, and so on. And the whole question of direct transference to a heavenly realm at the time of death. So there are all these kind of ideas hanging around in the background here. And all this lends a kind of magical or numinous power to the yogic attainment of power over life. This certainly doesn't override the more ordinary and pragmatic idea of getting another 5 or 10 years of life in the everyday sense. And some of the practice texts are very clear about this. You do this practice for 2 weeks and you'll get another 6 years of life. Or this kind of statement is quite normal. But the coexistence between the two has a certain mutually reinforcing effect. And I think a lot of the business of Sedgwick, in a way, is about creating this sense of magical or numinous power. But that does not necessarily mean that we're dealing with an illusion. We might make a connection here with analyses of the so-called placebo effect, or reanalyses by people like Daniel Merman, that stress the role of meaning and symbolism in promoting the body's self-healing powers. And I think if we think of this as something that's operating on the body's healing power, the healing powers of the body and the mind, on the immune system, if you like, it starts to make a different kind of sense. We could also connect with a long-standing tradition of symbolic analysis of healing ritual in anthropology. It goes back to Lévi-Strauss and goes on through people like Victor Turner and Bruce Kapfer and so on which I've spoken and written on other occasions. But the imagery at Sedgwick centres on interacting with healing deities who are able to overcome disturbing and damaging elements in the environment. And the particular Sedgwick practices that I was looking at, which is one of the main lineages of this kind, the deity is Amitayas in Sanskrit, Tepame in Tibetan, and here's an image of him. And I say that that's in referring back a little to Angelica's paper this morning, that if care is very much at the centre of what Amitayas is about, and also at the centre of the higher Buddha power, like Amitabha, of which Amitayas is a kind of projection. These tantric deities are seen as aspects of the underlying Buddha nature of the universe in one very common Tibetan formulation. But the Amitabha-Amitayas family is very much to do with compassion and concern for the sufferings of humanity. And this is really, that links to things like the red colour, for example, which codes that particular dimension of Buddhahood. Just to work with one thing about the image of Amitayas there is you'll notice that he's holding a vase on his hands. And this is the vase of long life, the Sevum, which is a central symbol of all of these practices of Amitayas. And it represents it holds the elixir of life, Jutsi Amrita, and it's a focus in the ritual, both the visualized vase and normally a material vase too, with a appropriate liquid inside it, in which the energy of the practice is focused. However, images are only part of what's going on in Sedra, but they get elaborated. So rather than just one Amitais, you can have a whole mandala of Amitais. This is a mandala with Amitais at the centre, and the dots around the side are subsidiary deities. Here's another drawn mandala, which again you can see things starting to get quite complicated. This is actually the one which is on the two side screens, is the mandala of the practice which most of my work is on, the Chimasogti, which is a 20th century practice, and by this stage things have become quite complicated again. Though the mandala, this is actually a sand mandala, drawn in coloured sand in 2 dimensions, is still quite similar to the ones we saw before, and again has dots and letters to indicate the deities. You could equally see this in 3 dimensions in terms of the deities in space in front of you, and you can see that here. But images are only part of what's going on in these practices. Like much Tibetan ritual, there is a systematic effort to engage all the senses, and both body and mind. In fact, the techniques of Sedra are closely related to similar tantric practices that are directed towards the attainment of Buddhahood or enlightenment. And one could say the basic mechanism of all of these practices is to do with the direction of energetic, emotional, motivational states within the body and mind. I suppose the kind of states that I was talking about already in relation to Tantra, really, in that first book, Mind, Body and Culture. In the case of the Sedra practices, the purpose of that directing of energy is to help the mind-body totality to resist illness and disease, and to maintain a positive state of engagement with its wider ecological context. And that wider ecological context, constituted by the world outside the individual, is very much part of Sedra, because the inside-outside distinction is already something that Buddhism tends to relativize quite strongly. And here again, I think there's some important links with Angelica's comments on the in-between space of emotions, and her discussion of the health impacts of negative emotional states, and the whole question of how do we handle getting into these kinds of negative states that 17th century Chinese doctors were talking about. How do we find ways to counter this? And I think looking at something like Sedra in terms of that process is quite useful. In other words, all this isn't just symbolic in a reductionist sense. It's more that the symbolism is used as a technique to manage processes that encompass body, mind, and external environment. As to how effective this might be, we do have a certain amount of data by now that suggests at least that people can gain a degree of control over bodily and mental processes in this way. But I don't want to go into detail today about how Sedra works. I've spoken about that on many other occasions. I thought I'd talk about another side which relates more to some of my recent work. How do these practices change and develop over time? In fact, we can trace the history of Amitais practices through Indian and Tibetan Buddhism for some 15 or so centuries. And particularly once they come to Tibet, we have practice texts and manuals that give us a fairly detailed picture of what the practices involved. Over time, they acquired more and more features and became more elaborate. I think we've just got a list here which gives some indication of different features that came in, particularly from the 11th to 12th centuries onwards. Now, this development raises some questions which I think are quite interesting. Wider cultures decide that certain forms of healing are possible or appropriate or worth cultivating. Wider particular features get added in at particular times. Now, we could answer because people felt they were effective, but that begs the question of what efficacy means and how it might be assessed. as some of you will know, that's already quite a big issue in medical anthropology and related fields. And I'm not going to produce a comprehensive answer to any of these questions this morning, but I will look at one specific and quite significant process of change for the Tibetans. And this is the incorporation of Salum, or what I call the completion stage process, the internal yogic processes into Sedra. Now, Sedra, we have quite a few texts of Sedra from Tibet that probably date from about the 9th, 10th centuries. You do not get any Salum practices in these. There's no use of the movement of energy through the channels and chakras and so on. They come in, basically, well, I'll explain a little about how they come in, but maybe we should start with, we should move to a more narrative mode. And here is Rachin Gurjidrakpa, or Rachinpa, who is a disciple of a very famous Tibetan yogi from the late 11th, early 12th century, and a disciple of an even more famous yogi. Milarepa, whose biography was translated into English and French in the 1920s and is probably about the #2 Tibetan bestseller after the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or maybe the other way around, I'm not even sure. Anyway, so Rachinpa is said to have made 3 visits to India, and the story refers to his 3rd and last visit, when he went off somewhat against the wishes of Milarepa. Rachinpa was a rather disobedient student on the whole, though he was seen as a very powerful yogi and whatever. But anyway, he went off to India, and Milarepa said, well, okay, you can, while you're there, you can fetch some practices and texts that I don't have here. So he spent some while studying some of this stuff with the guru called Tibupa. And at the end of his stay, he was about to set off back to Tibet. And Tibupa said to him, he went to say goodbye to Tibupa, and Tibupa said, well, why don't you go down to the local market? There's a show of some sort on there before you leave. And so he went down to the market, and while he was there, this local yogi came along and said, you're a very fine-looking yogi. It's a pity you're going to die within the next week. And Rachinpa was somewhat concerned about this and went back to Tibupa, who said, well, yes, that's perfectly true, you're going to die within the next week, but I wouldn't worry too much about it, because there's a really powerful yogini, there's a very powerful female teacher who lives near here, and you can go and get, and she's actually realized the deity Amitas, and you can go to her and get her teaching, and that will solve the problem. And so he goes along to, see if we got a picture of this woman whose her Tibetan name is Drupik Gilmore. We don't really know the Sanskrit name, but it might have been something like Siddharajni. It means the queen of the Siddhas, Siddhas meaning people who have tantric accomplishments. And she's often called Siddharajni in Western texts now. And so he goes along and takes the bags of gold dust that you used to pay for teachings in those days if you were a Tibetan going to India, and meditates for a while, and finally she says, you've learned how to do this, you'll live for another 44 years. And so he goes off back to Tibet, and Tibupa also says to him, actually I knew these practices too, but I thought it was a better idea for you to go and get them from Siddharajni, which is a little interesting. So he then gets back to Milarepa, and Milarepa, who you remember was not very keen on him going to India in the first place, says, these practices are absolutely fantastic, this is really impressive, deep stuff. We don't have anything like this in Tibet. So that's more or less the end of the story. Okay, now Siddharajni is already a fairly magical and legendary figure in this story. As time goes on, she becomes more and more fantastic. In the later biographies, she's 500 years old, but after all, she has power over long life. But she looks as if she's only 14 years old. She is actually the same person as Mandarava, who did long life practice with Basham several centuries earlier, and so on and so on. Other Tibetans are a little bit more cynical about this. The great Tibetan historian Gerdok Sala says, well, she said he was going to live for another 44 years, but he didn't really. The figures don't add up, and in fact, Gerdok Sala clearly had some doubts about whether the two of them ever met at all. But there you are. Anyway, he passed on this practice to Milarepa, who passed it on to, supposedly, to various other people. Now, all this is part of the mystique of the practice, and in fact, most Tibetan tantric practices have got narratives attached to them of how they originated, how they were transmitted, and how unusual and special they were, and they're all unusual or special in one way or another. At the same time, it isn't all magic and mystery. There's a practical and everyday character to Cedric too. These practices are performed widely even today. People, tantric lamas and practitioners of tantric yoga, that is, with sufficient expertise in yogic techniques, can perform these practices for their own benefit or for other people in response to health crises or just as a kind of general blessing. Lamas may perform these practices for patients in hospitals. They also may perform them at big public gatherings, say long life empowerments, to convey the blessing of long life to their lay following. The abstract for the paper, which some of you may have looked at, is a bit ambitious, and it mentions two names from the early 11th century, Siddharajani, who you've met, and Vageshvara Kirti. I don't really have time to discuss Vageshvara Kirti here in any detail, but he was a scholar at one of the monastic universities. Okay. So, who produced this text on how to avert death. This is the German translation. There's a not very good English one which has got a lot of it left out. This one's reasonably solid, though it's got lots of commentarial stuff as well. I'll come back in a little while to that. So he was very much the monastic scholar who wrote a treatise on this stuff. Siddharajani is the magical female Dakini spirit who has somehow mastered and become identified with the deity. And the contrast between them is a bit like the relationship between the practical and numinous sides that I was talking about before. But what was distinctive about Siddharajani's Amitayas practice wasn't just that it came with an impressive story. It actually was different. Specifically, as I said, it was the first Tibetan long life practice, or I didn't quite say, but it was the first Tibetan long life practice that included some of the internal yogic techniques. These are techniques that work with the circulation of prana within the internal channels of the body. And this is a process which, as many of you will know, has, and Vivian mentioned, has been compared with Chinese cell cultivation and internal alchemy practices, and may well have historical connections with China. It had already come into the tantric practices for the achievement of enlightenment at a considerably earlier stage, maybe about 800 CE. And in fact, Vageshvara Kirti does mention it in his book as something you could do in relation to long life, though the emphasis there seems to be more in terms of transcending the whole idea of life into some kind of other time space. He doesn't, in any case, describe how to do it in much detail. Siddharajani does give a bit of detail in a practice text which comes in a number of versions in the Tibetan canonical collection of translations, the Tenjun. which closes with a fairly short outline of the Southern technique. And in the early 14th century, we have a set of instructions by a distinguished Tibetan Lama called Vajra Gyaltsang Palsampo, who goes into several pages of detail on how to do Siddharaj in its Southern practice, and really makes it, you couldn't do it from the bit in the Tenjur text, but Vajra basically tells you a lot about how to do it. And by around the same time, versions of these Southern practices were also appearing in other Tibetan long life traditions, such as the Nyingma Northern Treasures, Tenma practices, and so on. A couple of generations later, the first Dalai Lama, or the Lama who became the first Dalai Lama, also wrote a text on these, borrowing heavily from Vajra, and so did Drukchen Pemakapo, another major teacher at that time. And from there they spread throughout the Kagyu and Gelug lineages of Tibet to become the dominant way of doing Amitabha's practice. So Siddharajni set something off, and all of these practices tend to be described as Drukgyalug in the mode of Siddharajni. So I suppose my question is, why did this happen? And I think there are a number of things to consider here. One is that we're in a sense in a situation where we have people who are lamas, monasteries who are competing for business. Everybody wants to have the most effective product. This is part, one can kind of push this a little bit too far, but I think when I wrote years and years ago about the shamanic aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, this was a bit of what I was hinting at. These are people who are like shamans in that they're competing with each other. It's not an absolutely rigid, settled state church at all. And the competition is at all sorts of levels. It also has a strong political dimension. So that's why having something that sounds really impressive has got good connections. So we've got a very respectable Indian scholar in the background. We've got Milarepa, who's perhaps Tibet's most famous yogi altogether, who's endorsing this as something really special that's come from India, and we don't have anything else like this in Tibet, and so on. The whole legend of Siddharajni, which you've already heard, which is quite fun and gets even better as the centuries go on. But I think there's something more here, which has emerged only recently, at least for me, which is that the internal yogic practices probably really do add an important and effective new element to the practice. At least something what has emerged recently, I think, is some neuroscientific background for how this works. 2 or 3 years ago, I did some work with Maria Kozhevnikov, who's a Russian-American neuroscientist who taught and researched for some years actually at the University of Singapore. And Maria established pretty convincingly that sadhana training, these internal yogic practices, does allow for considerable control over the internal processes of the body. That's just showing the 4-chakra sadhana model, which most of these practices, including Siddharajna, is operating with, and the set of 3 major central channels. Probably familiar to some of you, and others will see analogies with other things that you know, no doubt. She studied the famous Tummo, or psychic heat practices, which are an important part of the sadhana repertoire. That's the first article there. More recently, Maria and I were involved in a couple of joint articles. The first 2, I should say, are pretty heavy natural scientific neurophysics type articles. The third one is intended to be comprehensible to humanities people like some of us. And she makes it pretty clear how these do allow for control over internal processes. They use quite different physiological states, incidentally, from the more familiar relaxation-based meditation processes. These activate the sympathetic nervous system rather than using the parasympathetic nervous system. That's a bit of a simplification. They also enable significantly higher levels of cognitive performance. I don't want to push cognition too far. So, I can't at this stage draw a precise connection as yet between Maria's research and the health restoring effects of Tolling in the central context, but it certainly seems reasonable that both the physiological and cognitive science of the process could contribute. And I think I could spell that out a bit more, but I don't think we want to do that today. One could make similar arguments about the various other components that were attached to. I'll be over in a minute. Etc. The physical yogic exercises and breathing practices that go along with Tolling, the pharmacological contribution of the Chulen or Rasana practices, so there's a kind of medical pharmacological component to some of these too, the extra layers of narrative and symbolism that were added to the story and so on. But I just want to finish by saying, what does this tell us as a whole? Perhaps it's something that's rather obvious, and again it's been said quite often, particularly by medical anthropologists, but it seems to me that we still need to remind ourselves of it periodically, and I think it's come up a number of times in different ways already at this conference. Healing is not just about the kinds of physical and pharmacological interventions of contemporary medical science, valuable as those can be and certainly often are. It's also very much about the mind, body and environment as a totality. Traditional Asian cultures, such as the Buddhist culture of Tibet, have developed complex and sophisticated ways of operating with those elements. It's easy still at times for us who have been brought up with the canonical structures of Western science to think of these practices as not really medicine, as somehow outside of history, as purely about faith or subjective meaning. But they have a history and a structure with its own internal logic and rationality. And if we take the process of healing seriously, then we should engage with that logic and rationality, because there's a lot which we can learn from it in crafting the healing practices that might meet the challenges of our present situation and of the years to come.
Thank you and congratulations. Are we going to take one question?
Yes.
Yes. Want to see if there are any questions. Due to time, we can take one question. Any questions? Yeah, we have one in the very back. Oh, okay. Maybe that one first.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. I have a lifelong interest in Tibetan internal practices and Neidan internal alchemy. And also, I see there are differences and also convergences. And I wonder if you did some study also in how some of these ideas might have crossed the boundaries. So, for example, we see at a certain point in the internal alchemy in China, especially in India in the middle school, the central channel appearing. And that's something before you don't see. It's more the Dumai and the Ren Mai and the other Mais, but not the central channel. So I'm curious if you did some research on that, how these ideas might have come into the Chinese room.
Well, thank you. I'd be interested to know more about that specific issue about the central channel, because I would say that probably rather more attention has been paid to what comes from China to India than the other way around so far. I think Paul Demieville wrote many years ago about this, and other people like David Gordon might have picked up later on. But I think what one can say is firstly, there were trade routes, there were connections, and there were substances which were important for the particular group of people we're talking about here, like mercury, cinnabar, which was linked to alchemical processes, which were being traded between China and South Asia. My own feeling is that when yogic practitioners or whatever from different traditions get together, they exchange notes, they compare what they're doing, they talk to each other. So I think it would be very surprising if there were not connections, to be honest. At the same time, I think you can see, and I talk about this in Origins of Yoga and Tantra, there's a particular point where some very Chinese-looking practices do move into South Asia. It's around 800, 750, 800, maybe a little earlier. And at the same time, they are very thoroughly reworked in terms of Indian ideas. So exactly how this operates is a little bit hard to tell. I mean, I think we're finding a little bit more these days with some of the new research on, there's a text called the Amrita Siddhi, which is basically a long life yogic text, so it's outside this kind of tradition, which seems to, which is very Chinese in style and is picked up in the Indian tradition and then goes on to Tibet and so on. But I think we still have to get a detailed picture, and maybe in the next of these things that won't be that easy to do, but I'm sure the connections are there.
Thank you. And we have one more here. 我们这边还有一个. Yes, please keep it short. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I have a question. Because in China, we have a tradition to pursue long-lasting life. One of the important terms is take pills or take drugs. In your talk, you didn't mention about it or take pills or any tradition about it, anything to improve or in the way of longevity of practices. Do you have any ideas about these different traditions in the two cultures? Thank you.
Well, I think the reference was actually there on the slides, but you probably missed it because it was because of the way it was phrased. This is the reference to what's called Chulen in Tibetan, or it translates the Sanskrit term rasayana, which is very much a tradition of making medical compounds that have positive health effects and are particularly concerned with long life. This is one of the things that seems to come in around the 12th, 13th century. The text of Bhairavas that I mentioned that expands on Siddharajani's practice actually has a section on how to make pills, on Chulen. So do parallel texts in the Nyingma tradition. So it seems around this time they're coming in. There's also, of course, Tibet has a pharmacological tradition associated with Sowa Rigpa, and that there are references there in the Gyushi, the canonical text of Sowa Rigpa, to making Chulen pills. And there are other texts through which this is coming in at around the same time. So, no, I don't think that there is such a strong contrast here. And I mentioned mercury before. Mercury was a major component in a lot of these pills, both in China and on the Tibetan side, and Indian and Tibetan side. So I think there's a shared body of knowledge about this. But what is seen as important in different places and different times there isn't, and that's part of actually what I'm interested in here. Why do particular elements get included? Why do they get seen as more or less important? Bhairavas talks about how to make pills using basically mineral and plant ingredients. The first Dalai Lama also has a section which is Chulen, called Chulen, but it's a Chulen in which you're taking in breath of the night air, of the sky. There's no actual physical component to it at all. I don't know why, and perhaps I'm sure there's a lot more to that story, because there are probably, well, certainly several hundred and probably thousands of these practices in Tibetan texts. And I've only looked at a fairly small number of them so far. But so for some people this was important, for other people it wasn't, or you did it in a different way, and so on. But I think the idea is certainly there.
Thank you very much. And now would you please put your hands once again for Professor Samuel's wonderful and insightful talk. Thank you. And now Professor Messler would like to present the Author Action Medal on behalf of ICTAM to Professor Geoffrey Samuel. Yes, please look at the camera in front of you.